In this lesson, we're going to give registered users of our site the ability to sign in and sign out. This will let us customize the site layout with links that are appropriate for signed-in users or users who aren't signed in. And in later lessons, it will give us the ability to implement a security model. For example, we'll be able to block access to certain pages of the site. Let's take a look at a few mock-ups to get a sense of where we're going. Here's a mock-up of a basic sign-in form. We've got the top-level heading, and then we've got labels, email, and password. And the idea is that this works the way every other sign-in form on the web does. You put in your email address as the unique username, you put in the password, and then you click sign in. The task of this lesson is to get this kind of form to work. When users fail to sign in, that is to say, when the email address is invalid or the email doesn't match the password, then we'll just return a flash message that says invalid email password combination. This is different from the way we handle errors with a sign-up form, and we'll discuss why that is exactly. And we'll also uncover a subtlety with respect to this notice here. When users sign in successfully, we'll make a couple changes to the site layout. So here's an example of user's profile page after signing in. So you can see on the default sign-in page, when a user isn't signed in, we've got a home link and a help link and a sign-in link. But of course, when someone signs in, you don't want the sign-in link to appear anymore. You want some sort of sign-out link. So here we see an example of the kind of links we might want. We've got a link here for all the users in the application, and then we have an account link with a drop-down menu with a link to the profile, a link to the user settings, and a link to sign out. To get started with the idea of signing in, we need to talk a little bit about sessions. Recalling that Rails generally organizes controllers and actions according to the principles of the REST architecture, we can think in terms of creating something in the process of trying to sign into a website. So the thing we're going to create is a session. Unlike the creation of users, which involved persisting user data to the database, the session will not be stored in the database, but will rather be stored as a cookie on the user's browser. But we'll still be using the basic pattern of the REST architecture. Now, a session is a semi-permanent connection between two computers, such as a client computer, in this case running a web browser, and a server running Rails. In this case, those two computers, which logically are separate, are actually the same physical machine because we're running a server locally in our development environment. But of course, in general, the server and the client computer are different. We'll start by generating a controller to handle sessions. As in previous lessons, we'll work on a topic branch in Git. As in the case of users, we've suppressed the generation of tests, but that's not because we aren't going to write tests, it's because we're going to use integration tests. So let's generate an integration test for the general idea of authentication, and actually authorization will also go in here. So this is an example of an integration test that isn't tied to one controller, and that's one of the advantages of integration tests. I called here authentication pages, although not all the tests actually involve pages. Let's get started with a really basic test. Let's remind ourselves how we get started. Here's an example of a sign-up page. We've got this test, describe sign-up page, and then we visit the sign-up path, and then we test for the top-level heading and the title. So let's do the same sort of thing for our sign-in page. Instead of a sign-up path, we're going to visit the sign-in path. Let's just put this over here so we can see the parallel structure. So visit sign-in path. So you might imagine we're going to have to define a route for that. You might note that I didn't use full title here. You can go ahead and do that if you want. But everything runs through the same place in the application layout. It's all right here. So having used full title in lots of different places, I think it's probably okay to omit it, just for brevity. In any case, let's run this thing and see how it goes. And so it's failing, as we expect. Let's see what the failure is. So it says undefined local variable or method sign-in path, and that's a hint that we need to make a route. So let's think about the kind of routes we want in this application. Signing into the website will involve creating a session, which means that we need both a new page and a create action. And signing out will involve destroying a session. So let's put in a sessions resource here. Resources sessions, but in this case, instead of having the whole suite of actions, we actually only want 3 of them. We only want new, create, and destroy. And I just realized I've actually got an old style hash here. Let's change that. That's because of the way that the commented out stuff here. You can see it uses old style hashes. So I just copied that because it had an example right here. You can see it. So let's just clean that up though and standardize on the new style hashes. I'm going to restart Spork because I'm using it to speed up the test, but when you make a change in the route, you have to do that. Oh, and actually that's not going to work because this is going to give us the new page, but it's not going to give us the sign-in path. So we've got a match here of /signup to users new. So in analogy with that, sign in is going to map to sessions new. And while we're at it, let's put in a route for sign out. I'll have to move these guys up. We don't have to, of course, it just looks nicer. This is going to be in sessions destroy. Let's run the tests again and see what we get. So it should be a different error. Yeah, so now it says the action new could not be found for sessions controller. So let's look at the sessions controller. It's true, there's no new. So let's do that. So def new, rerun the tests. Let's move this up a little bit. So now we actually have errors for each of these examples, and in both cases we're just missing the template. So that's the view. Let's make a new page and save it. It's going to be in views, sessions, new, .html.erb. If we look at the other example of new that we've got a new users here. So remember that we've got a provide line for the title and an h1, so we can just copy that. We can really see the analogy. So instead of sign up, it's going to say sign in. And this might actually be passing. Nope. Let's take a look at the actual application. Go to /signin here. So that's actually working. That means the test ought to be passing. One thing you should always do in cases like this is to restart Spork if you're running it. Let's make sure it's not a problem with Spork. Nope. Alright, so this is a good debugging exercise. I'm going to use a method called save and open page. So I'm going to put a semicolon. This is something you can do in Ruby to put 2 expressions on one line. You can separate them with a semicolon. And in order to get this to work, you're going to have to use the launchy gem. And it wasn't part of the original Rails tutorial gem file used earlier in these lessons, so you'll have to go to the page where that gem file is online and replace your current gem file with it, and then run bundle install and also restart Spork if you're running Spork. So let's try this. What's cool is this actually opens up the page. It doesn't have any CSS, but it basically shows us what's going on inside the test. So this is really good. Now what's going on here is that we actually do have a working page. Now we know that the problem is not that the page doesn't have the right thing. Here's the problem. This has happened to me before. The problem is that we have not identified the subject of the test. So if you look back here, you have to say subject page to get the test to use the page by default. So when we say it should have selector, we want that to be referring to the page. So let's copy this. There we go. So this should pass now. Let's get rid of this line. I'm confident this will pass. There we go. Those are famous last words, but in this case I was right. Let's close this down. Take a look at the new page here. Before moving on, let's see how the REST architecture applies to the sessions resource here. Let's open up the routes again, and I'm going to show a table of correspondences. Alright, so here's a table of the requests, URIs, named routes, and actions for this sessions resource. So you can see that because of the mapping we have, /signin goes to the sign-in path, which is the new action. We're going to post to /sessions, which will be routed to the create action. And then we'll issue delete request to /signout in order to destroy a session, and that will be routed to the destroy action. So let's just put those actions in, even though we're not going to use them all right now. There we go. It's a little cleaner just to have them like this for now. So now we see the overall structure that we've got these three actions: new for rendering a page to have new sign-ins, which is, that is to say, new sessions; create, which will actually create the session; and destroy, which will sign users out by destroying the session. Alright, to get started with sign-in, let's take a look at the new page for users. This is the sign up. So what we're going to do here is have a form for sessions, but because sessions aren't going to be active record objects, we're not going to be able to do the same trick with form for @user. So we're going to have a variation on a theme, but the other things are going to be fairly similar. Let's take another quick look at the mockup. So in the case of an invalid sign-in, we want to have this notice appear. We're going to use the flash again with an error styling. Let's try to test for that expectation. We'll work an analogy with the sign-up test for users. So we're going to describe sign-in. And before anything, we'll visit the sign-up path, or the sign-in path rather. Over here it's the sign-up path. We'll visit the sign-in path, and then as with the failed creation here, we'll just click the button, which should certainly be invalid. So what this should do is just render back the same page. So it should have selector. Let's just use the title. Use this here. And we'll also test for a div. As we see here, the flash is going to be a content tag with a div, and then the class is going to be alert, and then in this case alert error. We actually did this before. It's this guy right here. Except instead of alert success, it's going to be alert error. In fact, let's just copy that. It's almost exactly the same. Now it's better to type it out. We're pretty new to these kinds of tests right now. So it should have selector div. Remember, the dot is the CSS syntax. It's really nice that Capybara supports this. And we can put the text, which is invalid. But this is a little marginal because this ties our test pretty closely to the implementation. In fact, even this is a pretty tight coupling. We'll talk about that issue near the end of this lesson. Let's save this and run the test, see what happens. Okay, we've got a couple failures, which is good. All right, so it's complaining that it actually can't find this sign-in. By the way, there's a hint here. It says no button with value or ID or text sign in. So one of the things about Capybara is that it can actually work not only with the text of the actual button, but it can work with the value, which is actually the value in HTML. So it would be input value equals something, or a CSS ID. Let me show you briefly how to find the Capybara documentation. By doing a web search on something like Capybara Rails, you should be able to find the Capybara GitHub page. But it's not obvious exactly where things are, so let me show you. There's actually a full documentation for the DSL, or the domain-specific language. There's a link here. And you can search for something like click button. And you can see the full reference here is Capybara node actions. And here's click button, finds a button by ID, text, or value, and clicks it. So by reading through the Capybara documentation, you can learn a lot about the kinds of things that it can do. You may notice some of the things that we've already used. We've got click button, click link, fill in. You can see that it supports lots of other stuff like select, uncheck. This is for things like select boxes or check boxes. All right, so let's get to work on that form. Let's move this over here. Actually, let's move this here and open up a new here for new users, just to give us some context. I'm going to copy these guys. We're going to use the same basic structure. I'm copying the closing divs too. But inside here, it's going to be different. So there's a different syntax for form for, and you can look this up in the Rails API, but I'll just show you how it works here. So we can do a form for @user, which automatically constructs a form, in this case for creating users. We'll see later on that you can also edit users this way. But in this case, we want a form for sessions, but sessions are not active record objects. So what we're going to do instead is give form for symbol, session, and we're going to actually explicitly have to tell it the URL. Now, in the case of @user, it knows to post to /users to create a new user, but in this case, we have to tell it that it's going to be posting to the sessions path. Remember that from our little table. Sessions path is the place that you post to create a new session, and that's at /sessions. So we have a form for sessions path. And now we're just going to have the same kind of labels. We'll have a label for the email address, and then a text field. And then one for the password. There should be a password field. And then we need a submit button. And we called it sign in. And let's give it some classes. In fact, it's the same classes as before. It's a button, it's a large button, and it's a primary button. Those are part of Twitter Bootstrap. And I'm going to add one more thing. I'm going to add a link to the sign up page, which is a good practice on a sign in page. Let's say if you're a new user, you should go to the sign up path. All right, let's run our test. definitely shouldn't pass, at least not in full, because we've done nothing with this flash. See if you can guess what's going to happen. We did something similar with the new users page where we just click the button inside of the test. So think about where this is going to be routed. Go to our sessions controller. Remember, this is going to be routed when we post to this URL. It's going to be routed to the create action. So that's going to be here. And so what Rails does by default is it tries to render a template corresponding to this action. But of course, there is no create template. So that's what it should complain about here. Let's run it. It actually complained about something even worse. There's a missing end. Let's fix that. It says it's on line 20 here. Oh, and it's actually not a missing end. It's because we forgot the form variable here. This is a block. We need to give it a form variable, give it a block variable, which we're going to call f. All right, so now let's rerun those. This is also a different error. Wow, this is chock full of errors. So what's going on here is the form for with the symbol. We actually have to tell it explicitly that this is the URL. So this is actually a hash here at the end of the form for. And now we should get to the problem that I identified before. So now we've got 4 examples and only 2 failures, so that's a good sign. Yeah, so now it's saying missing template, and it's missing the template sessions create. So let's think about this first test here. Let's just run this one. So this is the test that it re-renders the sign-in page. We can actually get that one to pass just by rendering new. Again, let's compare this to what we did before. The users controller, we render new here when the save fails. So this is for a failing sign-in. Just render new for now. Let's rerun our test. This should pass. Good. So that's this test here. And now let's run this the whole test suite. We should still have one failure because we don't have a flash in. So let's take a look at our actual web page. Let's refresh this. So we can see we do have a form. And if we click sign in, it actually does just render back here. So let's put in the flash message. Flash error equals invalid email password combination. Save that and refresh. There we go. So now we've got this message here. And at this point, the test should be passing. Take a look. There we go. So there's actually a subtle problem here, and I'll talk about it in a moment. But first, I want to just review form submission. So if you look here at the debug output, you can see that there's a session key, and then there's another hash inside of that with email and password as keys. So if we put in things like this, now we've got the email is showing up here in the hash, and then I just put in some garbage as the password. So if you think about what our strategy for this create action must be, what we're going to do is take the email, which is in params of session of email, so it's a nested hash, and we're going to try to authenticate that. First, we're going to take the email address and pull the corresponding user out of the database, and then we'll authenticate that user using the submitted password. Think about how you might do that while we investigate this other problem that I'm about to show you. So here we've got this flash message, and there's something bad that happens though. Let's click on the home page. So you can see if I click to the next page over, it still says invalid email password combination. If I click sign in and then I go to help, the flash message still appears. And that's because the flash persists for one request. So if I refresh this, it'll disappear. Similarly, if I submit it and then go to help and then go to home, it will disappear. And the reason for that is because this render doesn't constitute a new request. If we were to redirect here, as we did before in the users controller, then it would work just fine. So what happens here is that we put this message in the flash and then redirect. But in this case, we're just rendering it. So what we really want to have happen is that after you visit another page, it should disappear. Of course, refreshing should have the same effect, but in a test, it's a lot easier just to visit another page. So let's put in another describe block here for that case. So let's just click the home page link. And then we expect that it should not have this error. So let's put that in here. And actually, let's not specify it quite so stringently. Let's just get rid of that. So it should not have that selector. We can run this test, and we'll see we'll have a failure. And the solution to this is to use a special variant on Flash, which is flash.now. It says put something in the Flash right now. So this will persist for one fewer requests. Let's save that and run it. And there we go. Now it's passing. We can check if we go to the sign-in page. Click it again. And then I'm going to click on home, and it should disappear. Good. All right, now let's talk about what we expect to happen on a successful sign-in. So when a user clicks this button with valid email and password information, there are a bunch of things that should happen. We're going to plan to redirect to the user's profile, so the title of the page should include the user's name. And then there are at least 3 changes that should happen in terms of the links on the page. So let's take a look at that mockup again. All right, so after signing in, we expect it should have a link to the profile. It should also have a link to sign out, and it should not have this sign in link. It doesn't make any sense to have this sign in link if the user is already signed in. Let's express that in our spec. So we've got describe with invalid information here. By the way, if you don't know about it, Sublime Text supports code folding, so you can do this with valid information. And as with the case of the user pages spec, let's just look at it here. We're going to fill in this case, the email and the password with valid values, and then we'll click the button. In order to get this to work, we actually have to have a user in the database, so it can be pulled out. We'll use let for that. And factory girl. We'll create the user. And then before anything, we want to fill in. Remember, we already have visit signup path up here. So we visit signup path, and then we fill in email with the user's email. And password. With the user's password. And unlike the user pages spec, where we have this expectation with the click button inside the block, in this case we're not going to do that kind of thing. Instead, we're just going to test the high-level behavior in terms of the changing of links. Experience shows that actually testing the low-level behavior of sessions is quite error-prone, and different versions of Rails will break it. So I've learned that it's a better idea just to test the high-level behavior of the application. So what that means is we're going to actually put this click button in the before block. And now we could express our expectations. It should have a title selector with the user's name. The text here is the user's name. And then there are 3 links it should have. So we're going to use the have_link method here. It should have link profile. This is from the mockup. It should have a profile link. And have_link takes an href. This is just the hypertext reference, or the address of the link. In this case, it's going to be the user path of the user. Should acquire a new sign out link, which will go to the sign out path. and it should not have a sign-in link. So let's run these tests and see how we do. We've got 3 failures. And if you think about it, that's 1 fewer failure than we expect, because we just added 4 failing examples. So let's run just this block here. So the sign out link is failing, the profile link is failing, and the title link is failing. But this expectation here should not have links sign in with the sign in path is passing. And the reason for that is that if you go to the layout, let's go to the header, we actually still have this sign in link stubbed out. So you might recall that we have tests for these sorts of things. This the static pages spec has these kinds of clicking around the layout. So we can add a test here. You see, in this particular case, I'm omitting parentheses for no particular reason. Let's be consistent. Full title, sign in. Let's run these tests. Should have 1 failure. Oh, actually, I did Shift Command E. Let's just run the test in this file. Yeah, so 1 failure. So let's remove this stub and put in sign in path. Run the test again. It should be passing. Good. Go back here and run these tests again. Now we should have 4 failures. Good. All right, so now let's talk a little bit more about what's going to happen in this create action in the sessions controller. Recall that if you click sign in here, we have a session key in the params hash, and then we've got another hash with keys email and password, and here the values are just whatever submitted. So let's take a look at the console to get a handle on what we're going to do. So what we're going to have here is a params hash, and we're going to have a key session, and it's going to have another hash with keys email, which is going to be, let's just do it with a blank, and password, also blank. So what we're going to do is try to pull the user out of the database. Now remember, we're using the email as a unique username, so we're going to do something like this. User equals user class, capital user, dot find by email, and then we're going to pull the email address out of the params hash, which is params of session email. Now think about what this is going to do, because right now the email is just blank. So this return is nil, as you might expect. Now suppose that isn't nil. Let's put in the email address that's actually in the database right now. You might recall that it's example@railstutorial.org. Now do the same thing. Now it finds the user. Now you might recall from lesson 6 that HasSecure password allows us to authenticate using the password. So let's look at our expectations here. This is why it's nice to have tests even if you have a well-tested library like HasSecure password. Actually, it's the user spec. So here we go. So what is the return value of the authenticate method? Well, with the valid password, it should actually return the user. With invalid password, it should return false. You can see it should be false. So let's start with the invalid case. User.authenticate, and then we're going to authenticate with the params of session, of password, Remember, the password here is blank, so this should be false. Good. Now let's put in the real password, which is foobar. Now, in this case, this authentication should just return the user. There we go. So let's summarize these cases. So what we're going to do in our controller is write in this construction. Let me show you. We're going to do user ampersand ampersand user.authenticate params of session of password. So this double ampersand, as you may recall, is the logical AND operator. And so let's take a look at a table of the possibilities. So if the user is non-existent, that is to say the user is nil, and the password is anything, it doesn't matter what the password is if the user doesn't exist in the database. In other words, if the email address doesn't correspond to a user, this nil ampersand ampersand anything else will evaluate as false. If the user is valid, that's to say that the email address is in the database, but the password is wrong, we'll get true. Remember, anything other than false and nil is true in a Boolean context, so in particular a valid user is true. We'll get true and false because this authenticate will return false, which yields false. True and false is false. But only if the user exists in the database and this authenticate is given the right password will we get true in both cases, so we get true and true, which is true. In other words, this expression here evaluates to true if and only if the user corresponds to a valid email address and the password is correct. Now, this might seem like an awful lot of trouble, but this kind of line is idiomatic Ruby. So it's a really good idea to be able to read something like this and understand what it does. So let's go to our create action. So our first step is going to be to pull the user out of the database. So user.findByEmail params So this pulls the user out of the database, and then we want to say if user and user.authenticate with the password. Well, what are we going to do? In this case, this actually will require signing in the user. So in this case, we want to sign in the user, and then we've decided we want to redirect to the profile page that's here. Our expectation is that the resulting page will have the user's name in the title. So we're going to redirect to profile page. Remember, we can just use the user itself in this case. Else, we'll have this error. Now you might notice that we haven't addressed these guys at all, these changes in links. So in order to get this full machinery to work, there's a lot to do. So it's going to be a while before we actually are in a position to change these links based on the sign-in status. And indeed, much of the rest of this lesson it will involve building that machinery. So let's run our tests. We should be in pretty bad shape. Right, we've still got our 4 failures. And you can see the error here now. It says undefined method sign in, because in fact we don't have a way to sign in right now, which suggests that that's what we should work on next. At this point, our main task is to write a working sign-in method. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to put it in a module and then include that module in the rest of our application. So we're going to put it in the sessions helper. Just open it up here. Now the reason I'm using the sessions helper is because there are going to be a lot of methods associated with sessions, and they're all going to go in here. And you may recall that by default these helpers are included in the views, but they're not included in the controllers, and you can see that we need it in both the views and the controllers. Well, actually we don't need sign in the views, but we're going to need a bunch of the other methods in the views. But we do need sign in the controllers. So you could use a separate module for this, but I find it convenient just to use the sessions helper module. And in order to have this available in the controllers, let's actually just go into the application controller. And we need to include it. Let's just save everything and rerun the tests. So we should still have 4 failures here. So now it's complaining that sign-in has the wrong number of arguments right here. Let's change that. So sign-in is going to take a user, and then it's going to sign the user in. So the real task of the rest of this lesson, at least until we get to signing out, is going to be to fill this in with something that actually works. We'll talk in a moment about what that might entail. Alright, now we've actually got only 3 failures. You can see something is already passing. This is pretty impressive, actually. It surprised even me. So what's going on here is that now that we have a sign-in user method, it's not actually signing the user in, but it is actually doing the redirect. It's redirecting to the user profile page. This is why we tested the links in the layout as an indication that users are actually signed in. So right now, if we go here and put in a valid email address, and a valid password, we can click sign in and actually be redirected to the profile page. So that's pretty cool, but we still have the problem that nowhere in our application do we actually know which user this is. So if I clicked on this link, the information that we just signed in as the user with ID 1 has been lost. And this is because the hypertext transfer protocol is what's called stateless. So this is actually part of the HTTP spec. You're actually not allowed to remember information from one request to the next. So what we're going to do is put a cookie on the user's browser. This is a little piece of text that you're probably familiar with. So in this section, we're going to learn how to put a cookie corresponding to a particular user on the user's browser. The way we're going to do this is by creating a unique remember token for each user. This is going to be a string of characters that identifies that user uniquely. In principle, you could use the user's ID, and in fact there's a way to do this that's left as an exercise. But using a permanent cookie with the user's ID is really dangerous because IDs are really easy to guess. What we want is a cookie that is secure, that is to say that it's basically impossible to guess. So in order to do this, we're going to add a new attribute to users called remember token. Take a look at that. Now I find that when I have this many tabs open that it really helps just to get rid of all of them. It can quickly become overwhelming. So we're going to start with the user spec because we're going to be changing the model a little bit here. Let's go up here and see the things that it currently responds to. So here are the different attributes: name, email, password digest, password confirmation. And before this authenticate, which is just a method, I'm going to add a new attribute. You could add it at the end too, but I'm going to say it's going to respond to remember token. Should fail. And now let's generate a migration to add the remember token to users. Actually, let's leave off this remember token string so that we have to do it by hand. It's good practice. Let's find add remember token. And so what we want to do, first of all, is to add a column to the users table. It's going to be called remember token, and it's a string. And if you think about it, we're actually going to be pulling users out of the database using their remember token, because if somebody comes into the site, signs in, and then goes to another page, we have to have some way of remembering who the user is, and that's exactly what the remember token is going to be used for, which means that if you think about it, somewhere under the hood we're going to be calling find by remember token. Remember, we have the same issue with find by email. When we wanted to enforce uniqueness at the database level, we discovered as a side effect that we also had an efficient way to find users by email using an index. So anytime you are going to be doing find by some attribute, it's a good idea to put an index on it. So I can do add index on the users table and remember token. Space there for just to line it up. And let's migrate it. And prepare the test database, and then our test should be passing here. Good. Let's take a look at the user model. You may recall that we have this before save callback. I wasn't too happy about introducing that so early in the tutorial, but it was important for email uniqueness. In this case, we're going to add another callback, which is going to create the remember token before saving the user to the database. So let's write a test for this idea. I'm going to describe the remember token. So let's save the user. Remember, we have an @user here from the top. And our expectation is that the remember token should not be nil. It should exist. Or I guess more to the point, it should not be blank. We don't want to actually specify the detailed implementation, but it should certainly not be blank. So remember, the subject is @user, so we can actually just say subject dot remember token should not be blank. Let's save that and test it. Okay, so we've got that one failure. So what we want to do now is, before saving, we want to set that attribute. Now we could do this kind of thing, this user dot remember token, like this. Actually, let's get that to work. Let's just get it to pass. This is, of course, it's terribly insecure. This should actually pass, though. There we go. But this is not what I actually want to do, as you might imagine. We actually want to use a more secure way of creating a remember token. And this is going to take a page out of Railscast by Ryan Bates. We're going to use something called base64. In particular, we're going to use a string of length 16 composed of the characters A through Z, either uppercase or lowercase, the numbers 0 through 9, hyphens and underscores. And if you count those up, there are actually 64 of them, which is why this is called base64. But I don't want to put all of that stuff in this little block here. And so there's a nice alternate way to have a callback here. We can actually just give it a symbol with the name of a method. Let's copy this here. And then we're going to have a private method, because we're not going to use this except inside this user model. Remember, I'd like an extra level of indentation there. Create remember token. And now what we want to do is set the user's remember token. Instead of using this block variable, we're just going to set the remember token. So actually, let's see if this passes. It should fail. Yeah. So this fails because what this line does is it creates a local variable called remember token. In order to set the actual attribute of the user, you saw before we have user and then user.email, or actually here when the assignment user.email. So inside of a class, you might recall that the object itself is just called self. So the way to set this remember token is to do self dot. So this should pass. Good. And now we're actually going to use our base64. And this is in the secure random module. And again, I just lifted this right from Ryan's Railscast. It's called URL safe underscore base64. In fact, let's just take a look at what that does in the console. So let's just paste it in. You can see what the kind of things we get. Let's rerun the test. It should still be passing. Actually, I didn't save it. Good. So this will give us a unique string for each user. If you look at the Railscast for this, that's linked in the Rails tutorial book, you'll see that that Ryan actually makes sure that this remember token doesn't already exist in the database. But that's actually unnecessary, because if you do the math on how many of these base64 strings there are 16 slots, and there are 64 characters. So that means that there are 64 to the 16 possibilities. And that works out to be about 10 to the 29. So the probability of a clash is 10 to the minus 29. And if you really want to do the math on this, there are about 10 to the 10 people in the world, and the universe is about 10 to the 17 seconds old. So that means that if everybody in the world signed into the website once per second for the entire history of the universe, that would still only be around 10 to the 27 remember tokens. So you can see that there's really no problem. The probability of a clash is negligible. So this is actually a working remember token. There is one little detail that we need to worry about. You may recall that we already created a user in the database, but if you look at the remember token, it's actually nil. And that's because we added this attribute after creating the user. So what we'd really like to do is just save this user, and that will automatically set the remember token. Now, of course, in this case, we actually know the user's password. But in general, if we were the administrators of a website, we wouldn't know the password. The whole point of this hashing is that it's actually completely secure. Even the people who run the website don't know the password. So there's actually a way to save this user without using a password. So let's do that. What we can do is we can call save, and we can tell it not to run the validations. Remember, the validations enforce the presence of a password and a confirmation. So you can see now it actually sets the remember token. You can infer from this, by the way, that every time a user updates his information, he's actually going to get a new remember token. And that's actually a nice security precaution. It means it expires any old cookies. So if anyone happened to hijack the session, as soon as the user changes his information, that session would expire. So now we can look at the first user, and we can see that there's a non-nil remember token here. In fact, we can access it like anything else. And there we go. All right, now we're ready to start looking at this sign-in method. And at this point, we have a choice. There are a bunch of different models on the web for how to sign users in. Some websites will sign a user in just for that particular browser session. So if they quit and then come back, that they'll be signed out automatically. Sometimes there's a little remember me checkbox, and if you check that, then it will still remember you from session to session. We're going to go with the third model, which is the model used by sites like GitHub, where it just automatically remembers you. It knows that you're probably sophisticated enough to sign out if you want to sign out. So the way to do this is with what's called a permanent cookie. Let's see how that works. Rails exposes what's actually a method called cookies, but it works just like a hash. It's really cool. You can actually assign a hash with a particular key. And what this does is it looks like a hash as far as you're concerned, but it's actually writing a little piece of text onto the user's browser. These cookies take two key value pairs. There's the value of the cookie, which in this case is going to be the remember token. And then you can say when this thing expires. And the usual convention for a permanent cookie is to have it expire in 20 years. Now this uses a cool Rails helper. I mentioned this kind of thing briefly in lesson 4, but Rails actually adds these cool date helpers to the numeric class. Let's take a look at this. 20 years from now is actually in 2032. So let's save this and actually sign in. All right, so I signed in there, and now let's take a look at the cookies. Let's click on Content Settings. You can look at the cookies on localhost. You can see now there's a remember token. And there it is. And you can see that it expires in 2032. So this has actually put the token on the browser. So this is a pretty big step because it means that we're actually going to be able to retrieve this user using the token. Now this convention of having a cookie that's permanent and expires 20 years from now is so common that there's actually a shortcut for it. You can do cookies.permanent and just give it the value. Now before moving on, I actually want to show you a slicker way to do this remember token test. You can actually do this in one line with the its method. You can say its, or we have the subject.remember token. We can say its remember token should not be blank. This is the same thing, but it's a lot more succinct. Let's rerun that and make sure it's still passing. Good. All right, so we've got a way to put this remember token on the browser. And as you might imagine, we're going to do something like this. We're going to do user.findByRemember token. In fact, we can even just go to the browser. Here it is. You can see that's actually the user. This actually worked. So this is the kind of code we're going to have to retrieve the user, this user.findByRemember token. But there's a second problem, which is that we want to have some way of identifying which user it is. So here we've just pulled the user out of the database. And the way we're going to do that is with a special variable called current user. So when we sign a user in, we're actually going to set that user. The current user in this case is just going to be equal to the user. And the way to set this current user is using what's called a setter. This is potentially confusing, but the way to assign to this current user is to use an instance variable, and we're going to define a method called current user equals. It's going to take a user, and we're going to set an instance variable equal to that user. So you may recall way back in lesson 4 that we created a user class where we had an @accessor for name and email. Under the hood, what that did is it created a name equals and an email equals method. So this might look a little unfamiliar because most languages do not allow you to create a method with an equal sign in it. But when you type current user equals user, it's actually doing this. It transforms that into this. So it's actually a method call. But we can write it like this and make it look like a normal assignment. And so this captures the current user in this @currentUser variable. And we also want a way to pull the current user out. And remember that Ruby methods return the last expression evaluated, so we can just do this. We can just return the current user. But this is useless. If you think about it, we've already covered why. The reason this doesn't work is because if you click on a different page on the website, we can still try to get this current user variable, but @currentUser will now be null. The reason is because HTTP is stateless. So what we need to do is, in current user, we either need to return current user if it exists. In other words, if you just sign in, then this current user variable will actually be the current user. Or we need to find the user from the remember token. So what we really want here is the current user to be equal to the current user if the current user isn't nil, or if it is nil, we want to return the user corresponding to the remember token. Now you can see that we've gone into the 91st column here. I'm going to fix that in just a moment. So this might be a little mysterious. This makes use of the fact that Ruby returns as part of an assignment the actual result of the assignment. So if you do a equals 1, that returns 1. If you do a equals nil, well, so let's say a equals 1. So a equals a, that just returns 1. This looks stupid, but suppose a equals nil, Now we say a equals a or 17. It's going to be 17. Now, if this looks, this looks stupid, this a equals a. This is because something I mentioned in the fourth lesson. It's a really weird practice that lots of languages use this equal sign for assignment. So this is not the same as testing for equality. But in any case, this is how this sort of assignment works, and this OR operator is a useful way of assigning a variable to itself if it already exists. Remember, this instance variable is nil unless it's already defined. But if it is nil, then it should just give it its initial value. So if you think about it, what's going on here is we click on a web page, and if the user is signed in, we're going to be pulling this current user variable out and using it. And so when we access current user, the first time this @current_user variable will be nil, and so this will be nil, which means it will pull the user out of the database using the remember token. But on any subsequent uses of current user on that same request, @current_user will not be nil, and so this here will just evaluate to itself and will immediately return it. So what that means is that if you use current user, say 100 times on a particular web page, it's probably bad design, but suppose you did it, this design here prevents us from hitting the database 100 times. So we could just do this. But if we did this, then we would hit the database 100 times. So this technique is what's called memoization. It remembers the value from one invocation of the method to the next. By the way, that is a technical term. It's not memorization. And there's a shortcut for it, so I want to show you that. This is very common idiomatic Ruby, but it looks really confusing at first. Let's look at something like x equals x plus 1. Let's define x first. Then x equals x plus 1 gives you 43. And now x is also 43. And there's a shortcut for this in Ruby, as in many languages. You can do plus equals 1. So if you look at this construction here, we've got, in fact, we can actually even do this here. We can actually paste in this remember token and make a cookies variable here locally, and then this line will actually work. Because remember, an instance variable like @current_user is nil when undefined. So this is now set @current_user equal to something. It's equal to the user corresponding to that remember token. And so now if we run this again, it doesn't hit the database. In fact, it's just really cool. You can see it. This here indicates that we hit the database. It shows the SQL. So this second invocation should not hit the database, so we shouldn't see any SQL. And there it goes. So that's what memoization does for us in this case. And if you look at the construction, though, if you look at the analogy, this variable equals variable operator and then another variable is reminiscent of this x equals x plus 1. So in this case, we can convert this to x plus equals 1. In analogy with that, there's a shorthand, which is this current user or equals this stuff here. And you can see that now we're not running too far off the edge of the page. We're just in the 76th column. At this point, we actually have a working sign-in method. Let's see what happens if we run the test here. So these should be failing because remember the way we're testing for a working sign-in method is that we have these changes in the layout links. So we need to put this to use. We're actually testing the behavior. And so what we want to do here is look at the application layout. Most of this is in terms of the header. So the general strategy here is going to involve having a branch. We're going to have an if-else branch. We're going to say if signed in, and we'll have a Boolean, so it's a signed in question mark. If signed in, then we're going to have some links. And then else, we'll have some other links. So if they're not signed in, they should see a sign in link. So what we want to do is have something in here corresponding to the links for signed in users. So if we look at our test, we're testing for the profile link, for a sign out link, and for not having the sign in link. Actually, this should pass now. Let's do this. Let's put in an end. And now we should actually only have 2 failing tests. Nope, they're all failing. They're all failing because we have not yet defined signed in question mark. So let's do that in the sessions helper. Let's put it under here. So signed in question mark will be true if the current user is not nil, and it will be false otherwise. So we can say this. Remember, there's a Boolean, nil question mark, that's true if the current user is nil, but we want this to be, we want signed in to be true when this thing is false, and this thing here is false. So we need to negate this with a not. That's a bang character. Save that. This might actually work. There we go. So now we've only got 2 failures. So what's happening here is if we sign in, we actually get rid of the sign in link. In fact, we can go to our application and see that happen. Sign in. And so you can see up here in the upper right, the sign in link has disappeared. So that's a really huge step forward. In fact, at this point, what's left is just a little bit of nasty HTML and CSS. But this is the basic idea. So we now have a situation where if we click on another page, you can see the sign in link is still gone. So we have solved the basic problem of allowing a user to sign in. So the rest of this is just getting the details right. But this is a huge accomplishment. So we have a user signed in. We've remembered the user by putting a little cookie on the browser. And we're using this find by remember token to find the user based on the value of that cookie. So let's finish this up. There's actually some fairly sophisticated HTML and CSS here to get that little drop-down menu from the mockup. So let's do that. So if signed in, we're going to have a link to all of the users. And let's just stub that out for now. And now this is some Bootstrap. We're going to have an ID, which is called fat menu. It's going to be a drop-down menu. And then inside of that, we're going to have an href that has the same sort of stubbed out URL. Except in this case, it's because we actually don't want there to be a URL here. This is just the way that Bootstrap works. So we're now outside of Rails. We're talking about some web design with Bootstrap. So the class here is drop-down toggle. I mean, everything here is unnecessary from the perspective of Rails development. It's just nice to have the application look cool. And we're going to give it a data toggle attribute. This is actually for the benefit of some Bootstrap JavaScript that we're about to add. And our menu is going to be called account. And then inside here, we're going to have another unordered list of class drop-down menu. And here's where the links are going to be. So our LI is going to be a profile link, or the first one's a profile link. And the URL is going to be the user path of the current user. So here we're putting this current user to good use. Right here. We'll also have a link to the settings. We'll cover this when we talk about how to update a user's attributes. So we'll just stub that out for now. And our test also is testing for the sign out link. And let's put that below a little divider. This is just for styling purposes. This is the sign out path because of our routes over here. Got a sign out path. This matcher automatically gives us all these named routes. So sign out path, and it should be a particular method. Remember, the HTTP request for sign out is delete. In fact, I forgot something here. This should say via delete. And inside here, it should say method delete. Actually, this should be a string. So save that. Need to close off this LI. And actually, this unordered list should be on the same level of indentation as that anchor tag here. All right, let's save this. Let's take a look at that, and now we're passing. Look at that. So that means that the application should be working. And look at that. We are actually now signed in if you look at the thing in the upper right. But if you click on this, you'll see that there's something not quite working. In fact, look very closely at the address bar. You can see now we've got this Octothorpe here. And that's because, as I mentioned briefly before, we actually need JavaScript to get this to work. So there's one more step. There's some standard Bootstrap JavaScript that comes as part of the Bootstrap Sass gem. And where it goes is in application.js. Actually, let's look at the actual directory structure here. It's going to be an app, assets, remember this is part of the asset pipeline, JavaScripts, and then in here, we're going to add a line to include the Bootstrap JavaScript. Again, this just comes for free as part of the Bootstrap Sass gem. Let's save that and refresh this guy. And there we go. Look at that. Profile, settings. That's just stubbed out right now. And sign out. Sign out doesn't work, so that's our next thing to work on. All right, let's get started by writing a test for sign out. We can start by observing that in this describe with valid information block, the user is actually signed in at the end of the process. So that means we can describe what happens if you submit the information that's valid and then followed by sign out. In the future, we'll have a helper that signs users in, but for now, before we have that helper, it's actually more convenient to write this test inside of this sign in block. So what we're going to do is click the sign out link. And then we can test for a successful sign out just by testing for the reappearance of the sign in link. So let's do that. So it should have link sign in. So let's save that and run the test. It should fail, right? So let's recall where this is being routed. This is being routed to the destroy method in the sessions controller. Now we could actually do this sign out right here in destroy, but I'd like to keep the parallel structure with sign in by putting a sign out method here. So let's go down to the bottom here and just define sign out. It's actually sign out, which is with this an underscore. And sign out actually doesn't need to take any arguments. All right, so this requires some knowledge of the details of the Rails framework, but in this case, we actually want to just delete that remember token. If you look at the Rails API, you can read about cookies. So you can see here at the API, there's cookies.delete, and then the name of the cookie. So I'm going to use the parentheses here, it doesn't really matter. So we want to do this, and we also want to make the current user nil. This line probably doesn't really matter that much, but it's nice for completeness. And then in the destroy method, we can call sign out. And then we need to redirect somewhere. And this is the kind of thing we haven't specified in our application right now, but redirecting with the root path certainly seems like a reasonable thing to do. Save that and rerun the tests. And there we go. Now we can sign out. Let's take a look at this. Let's go back here. Let's just click around a little bit. Go to account and sign out, and this should work. And you can see now we've got to sign in. So this is now a working sign in and sign out. And there's one little detail I want to fix up. Let's click on sign up now. So let's click on create my account and keep a close eye on this up here, this sign in. Alright, so you see we have welcome to the sample app and we've got user's profile page, but sign in is still appearing. The reason for that is we don't actually currently sign in when a user signs up. So that's a little wart in our application that we should fix right now. So let's go to our test for the user pages spec. So after we sign up with valid information, and after saving the user, it should have a sign out link. I can run that and it should fail. Actually, I just did Shift Control E, which what that did is that ran these tests here. So let's run the test with the Shift Command rather. Shift Command E and then Shift Command T is what I just ran. And so we have one failure. And so the user's controller, all we need to do is inside here, after the user is saved, we should just sign them in. So let's do this. Because right here we've got sign in user. In this case, our variable is called @user. So we can sign in the user. Now Shift Command E is the right thing to do, and there we go. Now we're passing. So let's try this one more time. This is the kind of thing, by the way, this sort of testing by hand that the automated tests relieve you from. In the bad old days before automated testing for web applications, you had to do this kind of stuff all the time. It was just such a pain in the butt. And we signed in, and now we've got this little account drop-down menu instead of the sign in button. So we can sign out, and that works great. Alright, so we're basically done at this point. There's one more section I want to cover, which is an optional introduction to Cucumber, but this is such a good stopping place that I'm going to commit the changes we made. Let's run our full test suite. Alright, so we're green. Let's add everything. We finish sign in, and implicit in that is that we finish sign out as well. That's great. In this final optional section, I'm going to give a brief introduction to Cucumber, which is a popular tool for behavior-driven development. Cucumber allows the definition of plain text stories that describe an application's behavior. So if we take a look at our RSpec here, you can see that this is a description of the behavior of the application, but it's definitely code. This is Ruby code. In contrast, Cucumber is plain text, and part of the idea of Cucumber is that you don't necessarily have to be able to code to write Cucumber stories. Now, in order to use Cucumber, you'll have to install a couple of gems, which are included as part of the default Roth tutorial gem file. And you'll also have to run a generate command. Let's do that now. It's called Cucumber install. And this just creates a bunch of directories and files needed by Cucumber, including this features directory, which is where the Cucumber test will actually live. Alright, let's close down some of these tests. And now I'm going to open up a new file, save it, and it's going to be in the features directory. And I'm going to call it signingin.feature. If you look at the bottom right, you can see that Sublime Text has actually identified this as a Gherkin file. So Gherkin is the language used by Cucumber features. The way we start a feature is we tell it what the feature is. In this case, signing in. So what we're doing here is we're going to write some Cucumber features that replicate a subset of these RSpec tests. And this will make it easier for us to compare the two ways of writing tests. So the way that Cucumber works is you write scenarios. The first scenario is going to be unsuccessful sign-in. This corresponds to this invalid information here. And now we're going to say what the prerequisite is for this, and say that given a user visits the sign-in page, this is equivalent to saying visit sign-in path over here, when he submits invalid sign-in information, then he should see an error message. And our second scenario is successful sign-in. I should put an article in here, visits the sign-in page. In fact, this is the same, this first step. But the second one is different because we're going to say, and the user has an account, and the user submits valid sign-in information, then you should see his profile page, and he should see a sign-out link. Alright, now the way to run a Cucumber feature is with the Cucumber method. So the way to do this is with bundle exec Cucumber and then give it the directory. As you might expect, nothing is passing. It's because we haven't actually written any code. This is just English. There's a hint about what we need to do. It says you can implement step definitions for undefined steps with these snippets. And then it gives us a bunch of snippets. And if you look in the directory here, you can see in features step definitions, this is a big hint that we're going to put something in here. By the way, if you want to avoid typing bundle exec, you should rerun the command that you ran as part of the advanced setup. So I'm going to do that now. Now I can just do this. So let's create a file in the step definitions directory. Features step definitions, and let's call this authentication steps. Doesn't matter what we call it really. It's actually a Ruby file. All of the step definitions are available in any of the features, but this is nice to just partition our code. For bigger test suites, it's nice to have different files for the different test steps. So actually, let's put this over here because we're going to be looking at the correspondences. So we had a hint here. We had something like this. Given a user visits the sign-in page, just paste this in. Well, so what do we want this to be? A user visiting the sign-in page, that's just what corresponds to this this line here before visit sign-in path. So actually we can just copy this. Well, let's just type it in. It's good practice. Because one of the things you'll note is that this visit is part of Capybara. Capybara is available automatically inside of Cucumber. So let's go back and run these again. Now look at that, we actually have two passed, two steps passed, because now this visit sign-in path actually works. So given a user visits the sign-in page, those are now passing because of this. So you may recognize this thing in here. This is a regular expression. And this the caret and the dollar sign are just the beginning and end of the line. I actually probably wouldn't have put those in there, except this hint does have it. Okay. So these other hints give us lots of code to start with. Let's just copy these guys. And it actually says when he submits invalid information. Actually, that means there's a typo here. It should say when he submits. Okay. Let's just copy these steps. Is that the last one? Now there's one more. So there's a pretty good chance that you can guess a lot of these based on what we did with RSpec, but I'll fill them in to show you how to do it. He submits invalid information. So remember, just clicking the button is invalid, right? Because they're both blank. Then he should see an error message. Will just be that that matcher that we had over here. You can see that it should not have selector this guy. In fact, I will paste this just to emphasize. Well, actually, in this case, it should, right? It should have, yeah, it's this one. It should have selector. And actually, let's just not use it. It doesn't really matter. Let's just not use this. Now remember, in the context of this RSpec, we have a subject page, but that doesn't happen here in this series of authentication steps inside of Cucumber. So we do have to give it the page here, but it works just the same. The user has an account. Well, we're going to implement this by actually creating the user. Now there's almost certainly a way to use factory girl here, but just for simplicity, I'm going to use ActiveRecord to create a user in the database. And when the user submits valid sign information, we're just going to use Capybara again. So we can just fill in email with @user.email. Need a with here. @user.password. And then we need to click the submit button, which in this case is sign in. Then he should see his profile page. Let's just do that with the title matcher. And then he should see a sign out link. Page that should have link. Sign out. Let's give it the href too. All right, let's run these and see if they work. And there we go. Look at that. All of the steps passed. So let's go over here and break a couple things. Let's just comment this out here. See that this will catch those mistakes. So there's a failure. It's when he submits invalid sign-in information. So this is how Cucumber works. Let's just get things passing. There's another way to run these Cucumber features, which is like this. If you have a mixture of RSpec and Cucumber tests, you can actually run them all just by typing rake. So that runs the specs and the features. And so we can see here that Cucumber gives you a nice layer. You've got this, he should see an error message, and then under the hood, we implement that with this page.shouldHave selector, and then the classes. On the other hand, there's a real disadvantage to having both of these. I find that it's really cumbersome to make them both, and I especially dislike having a plain text language. I feel like I'm a developer, I know how to write code. I don't like things that don't give me the full power of Ruby. Now what I found is a lot of people do use Cucumber for this sort of integration tests, and part of the reason for that is because there was a time when RSpec didn't support integration tests, but it did have Cucumber. And so I think a lot of people started using it because it was the only tool that filled that niche at the time. But at this point, it doesn't make any sense to me to use it unless you really have a compelling reason to have these sort of plain text scenarios that you can show to a client, or in what seems to me a somewhat implausible scenario where the client can actually write the features. But given that the features have to be very tightly coupled in terms of the strings here with the regular expressions, it seems unlikely to me that very many clients write these things, at least that they would write ones that work. But I can see how if you do a lot of client work, it might be valuable to have these sorts of scenarios that you can show to your clients in order to explain to them what the application does. But if you're writing programs for yourself or for a startup or for a company that has lots of developers, it seems to me that RSpec is much more flexible. Moreover, there is a way to get this sort of decoupling where you have something like he should see an error message, and then under the hood it's actually doing this with the have selector. So as a final step in this lesson, I'm going to show you how to use RSpec custom matchers to achieve something similar to what Cucumber does. Alright, let's go to our authentication pages spec, and we have this here, this it should not have selector div.alert.alert error. Now this is fairly tightly coupled to the implementation. So suppose we want to replace this one with it should have error message. And this should not have error message. Let's run that. Of course it'll fail. Now let's go into the utilities, which currently just includes the application helper so that we can use full title. And now I'm going to define an RSpec custom matcher. So we're going to add to the RSpec matchers a new definition, so that's .define. And the name of the matcher is a symbol. And now we need to give it a block variable. And the reason that we have to do this instead of just defining a method is because RSpec generates human-readable error messages for success and failure. So by using this RSpec matchers, we automatically get those. So we have match, do page. This is just the syntax. You have to look it up, and I wouldn't have guessed the syntax if I hadn't found it online. So now we need the actual syntax, page.should. Now we can paste in what we copied there. Page.should have selector div alert error. Let's run that. Actually, let's restart Spork. I'm sure we're going to have to do that. Now let's rerun the test. And we're passing. So by making this RSpec custom matcher, we can have this kind of decoupling that Cucumber gets. So instead of having he should see an error message, which corresponds to this here, instead we can define an RSpec custom matcher, have error message, and then define it in the utilities like this. So this gives you the same kind of decoupling, but everything is Ruby. So if you're working on an application and you find that this sort of tight coupling where you actually have this kind of have selector is causing problems, then consider making RSpec custom matchers for that situation. Alright, that concludes our introduction to Cucumber, and with it, our sign in and sign out functionality. So let's make a final commit and push things up to GitHub and to Heroku. Actually, there are just a couple things I want to clean up first. There's this space that's been annoying me. I forgot to change it, so let's just line these widths up. That's relatively minor, but let's rerun our test here. I just want to show you something. You might recall that in controllers and views, you can actually replace this with just user. Instead of user path user, you can just use user or @user, depending on what the variable is called. You can see that that actually doesn't work inside of RSpec. So that's why I used user path user inside of RSpec. There's a place though where we can make that substitution. It's in the header. So there's this spot here where we have user path current user. This will work, but we can actually remove the user path there and rerun the test just to show that it still works. And there we go. Can merge in, sign in out to the master branch. Let's run everything with rake. Because our Cucumber features cover a subset of the RSpec tests, I won't usually do this. Throughout the rest of the tutorial, I'll mainly just run RSpec spec. But it's nice to see how it's working here. Let's push it up to Heroku to deploy it. And now remember that we changed the data model, so let's migrate the database on Heroku. That's with Heroku run, rake db migrate. Again, you should ignore those deprecation warnings. It just involves these vendor plugins, and we do not have any plugins in vendor plugins. I actually think it's annoying that there's an error message there. If you look at vendor plugins, there's nothing there. So there's one more thing we need to do. Remember, at the console, we gave our user a valid remember token. Let's do the same thing at Heroku. So here's the Heroku console. Let's just verify that it's running in production. Remember, we've got this Boolean, true, so it's running in production. And now let's iterate through all our users. There's only one in this case, but it's possible that there are multiple users if you played around with your production deployment. So let me show you how to do that. User.all, let's iterate through. The block variable is just call it user. And now what we're going to do is save the user while skipping the validations to give the user a valid remember token. There we go. Now let's open it up. Sign in. That was an invalid password, so that's working. And there's a valid password. And as you can see, we now have our drop-down menu with the profile and a sign out. And there we go. It's working on the live website as well. This is a short addendum explaining a subtle error in the sessions helper. Let's take a look at it. There are two lines here that aren't quite right. There's this one here, current user equals user, and this one here, current user equals nil. To understand what's going on, let's take a look at the user model. You'll recall that we had to use self dot here, because otherwise, if we just do remember token equals the stuff on the right, that this creates a local variable instead of actually assigning to the user's remember token. In this case, the local variable is called remember token. Here, what we're doing is actually creating a local variable called current user in both of these cases, which isn't what we want. What we want to do is actually invoke this current user equal method. The reason that we didn't catch this is that it actually doesn't matter in our current application. Let's take a look at a couple controllers. Here's the user's controller, the sessions controller. And you'll note that after signing in and signing out, we immediately redirect. Same thing here in the user's controller. We sign in, set a flash, and then redirect. After the redirect, when the new page is accessed, what's happening is it's using the current user variable, and that's just going to pull the user from the database using this. So this line here, current user equals user, and current user equals nil, would only matter if we did something in the application before redirecting, which we don't currently do. So one way of handling this would just be to get rid of these lines. And actually, that's not a bad solution. The other way to solve this issue is to prepend a self dot, as in the case of the user model. Now, if we were ever to actually rely on this behavior in our application, it would probably be a good idea to write a test to catch this issue. One way to do that would be to write a sessions helper spec, and then verify that when the sign-in method is called, that it actually sets an @current user variable. But since we don't rely on that behavior, at this point it's probably not worth the trouble. Let's commit these changes. And there we go.